Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. We are looking forward to today's presentation here at Ridge Security. We are going to be focusing on some different use cases in the RidgeBot platform, specifically how RidgeBot can be employed by cybersecurity teams as a force multiplier and exploring some of those different use cases along the way here. Very excited for today's presentation. My name is Brian Nyber. I'm the Western Region Sales Director here at Ridge Security. I'm joined on this presentation by Dennis Cassidy and Kevin Sisney. You guys want to take a minute to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brian, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Looking forward to a great session here. My name is Dennis Cassidy, Regional Sales Director here on the East Coast of the United States. I'm located in Boston.
Hi, team. Again, glad to have everybody on. My name is Kevin Sisney. I've been at Ridge about 10 months, going on 11, and I spent about a little over 15 years as a practitioner working on endpoint, vulnerability and risk management, blue and purple teaming across multiple domains, and look forward to showing you the tool today.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll go ahead and dive into it. Please feel free to use the Q&A function here along the way. We'll do our best to incorporate some of the feedback from the attendees in this presentation as we go through. This is a little bit of a shifting of the gears, so to speak, for us. Our previous installations of the Demo Day series have focused on more of the MSSP and consultancy use cases. Today, we're going to be focusing on how the enterprise client can employ the RidgeBot solution in their cybersecurity stack. And Kevin, one of the things I hear you talk about during pretty much every one of our presentations is how you would have used this product as a practitioner. I would love for you to talk just a little bit about your experience as a practitioner and some of the areas that you would see RidgeBot fitting in, and maybe we'll pull up the application and dive into some use cases from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So being my last stint as a practitioner was in fintech, heavily regulated, heavily audited. And, you know, I could have used this to get ahead of all of my pen tests. When I came on board, they had 18 months worth of catch up to do from their last audit. No vulnerability and risk management in place. But I definitely could have used this to get ahead of the auditing, to get the exploitable things out of the environment quicker for those audits, and either internal or external, you know, with the big auditing firms. And that's how I would have used it, just to basically stay on top of the exploitable risk in the environment, which is what RidgeBot's there for.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think there's a couple of things that I hope our audience sees over the course of this presentation is one, from the vein of being a force multiplier, using RidgeBot allows clients to get far more testing done than they would have traditionally been able to do, but not necessarily in the sense of just a comprehensive pen test, but also really targeted testing along the way. Being able to look at individual parts of their infrastructure, being able to look at different web applications or segments of the network. So it's also a very, I think, surgical tool in that regard, in addition to be able to doing very broad pen testing. The other element that I think we focus on very heavily, Kevin, and you talked about it, is the difference between exploitable and vulnerable. There's thousands of CVEs minted every year. It's really impossible to try to keep up with all of those, but I don't think organizations necessarily need to keep up with all of them. What they need is a way to contextualize the risk in their environment and prioritize the right things, and those are the exploitable risks that can truly be leveraged by a threat actor, which is what RidgeBot aims to prove out. So you have a new perspective on that remediation and the prioritization of the right vulnerabilities, right?
Absolutely. I spent some time working for one of the big three vulnerability remediation companies that had other tools. And, you know, what we would find is that prioritization, even each tool has its own scoring mechanism to tell you what you should patch first. But even that gets very noisy, and that's what RidgeBot is good at doing, is reducing that noise and pointing you in the area of exactly what's exploitable, whether it's an asset, Windows, Linux, what have you, or a website or web application, or your APIs. And then we also have the added feature of breach and attack simulations, where we can look at security controls across 3 silos in the environment as well.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most compelling things about the RidgeBot solution is just how comprehensive our testing capabilities are. You don't have to go buy different products to be able to do network infrastructure, web application, API pen testing. We layer in those breach and attack simulations to give our clients a really, really comprehensive tool set that they can run a variety of assessments and get a real good perspective on security across the entire organization.
Agreed.
Does it
Agreed.
make sense, Kevin? Should we go ahead and pull up the application and
Yeah.
maybe start with a little bit of the network pen testing scenarios?
Yep. I will share my screen and do my talk about can everybody see my screen okay?
Looks
Ryan,
good.
Dennis? Okay, good. So let's talk a little bit about what RidgeBot is and what RidgeBot isn't. RidgeBot is not a SaaS platform. RidgeBot can be installed on a bare metal server, even down to a small form factor like a Nook type PC, as long as it meets the hardware requirements. It can be installed in your virtual environment, VMware, Hyper-V, Proxmox, KVM, Nutanix, and several others. Can also be deployed in the public clouds of GCP, Azure, and AWS with pre-built AMIs in the AWS and Azure marketplace. So very easy to deploy. We give you multiple options. None of the data that RidgeBot collects leaves. The AI models are pre-trained and then installed on the appliance. We're going to look for a licensing heartbeat to verify the licensing. And then every other week, we have plug-in or programmatic updates that you can go download to the appliance.
And Kevin, I feel like that, is one of the often overlooked elements of this application is being an on-prem solution where all of the data stays fully self-contained in the application. It's not leaving to train our large language models. Your ultimately really, really sensitive data isn't residing in our cloud. That feels like a real differentiator from a practitioner point of view.
Correct, absolutely. Even though everything is mostly SaaS today, this type of appliance, in my opinion, should be on-prem. The data is kept encrypted at rest and during testing on RidgeBot. So in RidgeBot, and what I'll do is I'll kind of do an intro into it and kind of get started and then kick off that network test and then turn it back over to you, Brian, okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, so in RidgeBot, we bring you into the task section of the appliance, the tool. I can create new tasks. I can look at running or completed tasks. I can also do reporting, clone or rerun tasks if need be. RidgeBot needs two things for a task to complete successfully. For network testing, I need either an internal or external IP address, a group of IP addresses, or if I'm licensed for it, a site or subnet of IP addresses as well. I also need a scenario. My scenarios are my pen testing use cases. For this one that I'm going to kick off, we'll do a host penetration test. We have cloud penetration or cluster testing for EC2 or EKS clusters, API, website, Windows authenticated, which is another type of host pen test that we can do. We've got two different ransomware scenarios for hosts that we can look at different advanced persistent threat actors, the vulnerabilities and the exploits that they use. And then at the bottom with the orange ribbon, we have our breach and attack simulations, where we can look at and test security controls by trying to recon, elevate privileges, and move laterally within Active Directory and look at those block rates. I can simulate data exfiltration to look at data loss prevention controls and simulate that behavior, and also endpoint security, looking at the EDR, XDR, and firewall applications, and try to simulate a malicious file download and look at the block rates that pertain to those security controls. We also have an attack surface identification. This is one of your first scans that you run in the environment and then run on a continuous basis to always have a handle on that attack surface. This particular scenario does not count against web or IP licensing. You can run it as many times as you want against as many URLs or as many IPs as you want. And that helps you keep track of your attack surface, keeps the asset table updated with new hosts on the network. I can also create custom scenarios. As you can see, I've got one for log4j. I use one of my system scenarios as a template. Then I can look for specific threats in the environment with a much smaller plugin and job set, so I can get through the environment much quicker looking for that new threat. Or I can look for specific parts of the environment, being WordPress. I can look at my MySQL. I can look at my FortiGates, my Cisco gear, VMware, what have you. And I can target different areas of the infrastructure instead of doing large swaths of it. And I can look for specific exploits and issues in my environment.
So, Kevin, that's a really great point that you just brought up there. Which teams would you see potentially leveraging that? That feels like something that maybe a red team would use to be able to look at a particular part of an infrastructure, do a really tactical search to look for a specific type of vulnerability versus a much broader, more disruptive pen test, right?
Absolutely. That would be exactly what I would do in a red team, is focus on, and I did it with my vulnerability scanners, is focus on certain areas of the infrastructure instead of taking huge swaths at it. Then I can get very focused. I know what team handles that part of the infrastructure, and I can get them the ticket, case, project, what have you, to get working on that remediation.
Yeah, I think oftentimes, the concept of a penetration test feels like this very massive, disruptive, expensive exercise.
Yes.
And traditionally, when it was a human-led pen test, that's probably the case. But I think that's one of the huge advantages that clients can see with RidgeBot, is being able to do much smaller, much more tactical testing.
Yes, absolutely. So, in reference to what, I used to do in my past life as a practitioner in fintech, is there was not any given time that I didn't have an auditor at a site in one of 7 states. So I could have used this on a continual basis, following up my vulnerability scans to get that priority list out to each individual team of fix this first, and then I'll get you the vulnerability reports after. This is your priority list, go fix.
Yeah, makes total sense.
Yep, absolutely. So let me kick off a network test, and then I'll stop sharing and we'll have a couple more discussions. I'm back in my task section. I am going to create a new task. I am going to select the appropriate scenario. For this, it's host penetration, which, even though it is a host penetration test, also does some entry-level web application scanning as well. The website penetration scenario will do a much more in-depth and robust web application scanning, but there is some that takes place with the host IP scan. My task name becomes my report names in the future, so they need to make sense. And I like to put my targets in. I can import a CSV file of a list of IP addresses. I can put in one at a time, multiples if needed, and also do CIDR notation if I'm licensed for it. I can exclude any targets. If I'm looking at a subnet, I can exclude, my .1s, my router interfaces, things to that nature. I can run it on demand, schedule it to run once. On a more continuous threat exposure management scenario, I can run it multiple times a week, say Sundays and Thursdays for workstations, and let's say every other Saturday for my servers or my infrastructure. So then I get this set up on a continuous revolving scans, looking at my environment for exploitable risk. I can also slow down my stealth level. I highly suggest that for any first scans. to make sure that we're not going to overrun any older infrastructure, any older web applications, keep it nice and slow and not very noisy. After I've reduced my risk, I can also make this test very noisy and see if my EDR, XDR, my firewalls, my web application firewalls object to this kind of running rough in the environment. For this particular asset, I'm going to leave it normal. I can also connect RidgeBot to Jira On-Prem, Jira Cloud, GitLab, and ServiceNow to create tickets, projects, or cases in my pipeline if need be. RidgeBot also allows us to do email notification and Slack notifications after testing is completed. RidgeBot also has an open REST API to pull data out into other tools, as well as offering two forms of syslog out, being Ceph and Leaf. In my information recon, I can adjust multiple things with my test, my timeouts, my min-maxes, my retry rates. I can look for specific ports or all ports or custom port range. I get the first of my guardrails with RidgeBot. If I've got something again that I have never tested and is sensitive or a high value asset, I can turn my risk control to no impact. And RidgeBot will not go too far with its exploitations and will stop well in advance of causing any system issues or impact. To be honest, I have not needed to turn this on in a client environment to date, so just know that that's there as a guardrail. In network pen testing, I can also alter my lateral movement, my number of hosts, my depth. I can turn on vertical, and with a successful horizontal escalation, I can upload scripting to Linux or Windows hosts. But if I leave everything to the most part best practices, I've got about 5 mouse clicks in about 3 to 5 minutes, and I'm running a network pen test on either a small part, large part, or a group of IPs within my environment.
What's always stood out to me, Kevin, about RidgeBot, and I'd love to get your opinion on this from the view of a practitioner, is that I think we really do deliver on that notion of being a force multiplier. There's plenty of products out in the cybersecurity market that lean into that marketing vocabulary and those kinds of things. But to your point, you just made a couple of mouse clicks, made a couple of small configuration changes, and you've got a pretty comprehensive network penetration test taking place. You don't really need a massive team to run or implement the RidgeBot solution, but look at the scope of the testing that we were able to just perform with just a couple of mouse clicks.
Yes, exactly. And even, while that test is running, I can look at, what RidgeBot has found so far. I can even do a report preview, which I can show in a few minutes. But I'm going to let this test run. And since we're on that networking side, let's go in and look at a completed network host pen test. So I get a lot of good information on my initial screen of the pen test. I get my scoring, number of targets, attack surface, attack paths, and number of exploitable risks. I can see, obviously, red, skull and crossbones is bad, and I can jump around to different parts of the menu, but I'm going to go across the bottom, across the main menu. Looking at topology. With this being a host pen test, I'm already seeing URLs hanging off of my host. So if I didn't know that, that would be good to know. And I'm also seeing some vulnerabilities. And then I also see my risk, my exploitable risk in my environment. And I can walk that back all the way back to the IP and see what RidgeBot and how RidgeBot was able to determine that risk. I can also go through and look at individual kill chains of what RidgeBot was able to do. The attack sequence, found my open target. I am having all kinds of fun. And then found port 80 open, indexed the website, crawled the PHP, found the SQL injection, and then grabbed the database and the tables. And we'll look at this in a different screen as well and what that evidence looks like. I get my task summary during a running test. The number of jobs created and completed will be different. As RidgeBot discovers the attack surface, any active sites, open ports, and then determines any vulnerabilities, it goes back to the AI models and asks it for jobs to run against the target or group of targets. As it finds more vulnerabilities, it then will try to exploit those and ask for the jobs to do that as well. Of the 39 vulnerabilities RidgeBot found on this particular target, it was able to exploit 7 of them. I get a full attack log, which I can download in CSV format that goes from discovery of the target to detection and validation. I get a full attack surface going from sites to any ports, their services and applications that are tied to them, and then any URLs and any parameters that RidgeBot was able to pull from that crawling. In my vulnerability table, I get my exploitable risk displayed first, but I also get full remediation and mitigation advice against any vulnerabilities that RidgeBot finds. I get a description, scoring, full attack vectors, any industry references, payload, request and response as far as my evidence goes. And typically we will highlight any code issues, as you can see here. And then once we go to the risk table, we get a breakdown of all of the exploitable risk on this particular IP or any URLs that RidgeBot was able to crawl. You can see here we have a credential disclosure with Apache Continuum Arbitrary Command Execution. I'm able to see multiple passwords within the tool on multiple accounts. If I go to another form of risk, I've got a weak password. My administrator left a default password at this IP address. So now as a human pen tester, I can take these credentials, this port, this IP address and service, and do my further human pen testing if needed, or just remediate this risk out of the environment if need be. SQL injection. At this SQL URL, we were able through SQL injection to get one database that contained one table, and that table has confidential data. That makes sense. It's the user table. Now, once we've got our host pen test done, we've looked at everything in the environment. Now I need to report on it. So I go to my task that's completed. I'll click a report. I have multiple options in my reporting. For host pen testing, I can do a custom report, make it basically an executive summary, take all of the technical detail out. I can create a raw data or a CSV export. If I want to pull this data into a BI tool or Excel and massage the data that way. I can do a standard pen test report. And if you use PlexTrack, we can do a PlexTrack report extract. But I'm going to create just a standard host pen test report. I'll generate that. As that is doing that, we can see that we have that full report. You can see where my task name became my report name with a date and time stamp. But I've got one pulled up already. So let me pull that up. I'll make it a little bit bigger. Again, my task name became my report name, date and time stamp. You can bring in a company logo underneath the RidgeBot logo if you would like, disclaimers, and then we get to the start of the executive summary. I get a description of scoring, again, date and time stamp, how long the test took, all of my vulnerabilities that RidgeBot was able to find, the amount of those vulnerabilities we were able to exploit, my attack surface. Exploits by type. Penetration, distribution, business risk, which lists out all of my risk a testing configuration at a glance. If I do an executive summary type report, it would end here before any technical or asset details. I then get my asset, any fingerprints and open ports, and then I get directly into the risk. Scoring type, full attack vectors, description, solution, any industry references about the risk or the exploit, and then a full kill chain analysis, database count, table count, and then how RidgeBot was able to exploit this with SQL injection. Credentials obtained by the Apache issue, again, scoring vectors, solution. We do obfuscate the passwords in the reporting. You can have access to those in the tool as I showed. And then the kill chain analysis of how RidgeBot was able to exploit that. Onto my SSH weak password, and then so on and so forth. Once we get through all of the exploits, we then give full remediation and mitigation advice against the vulnerabilities that RidgeBot finds. And then at the bottom of the report, we give a full attack surface based on the target parameters and the scan parameters. So full circle, that is starting a network scan, looking at the completed scan data and reporting on that scan, doing a host or a network pen test with RidgeBot.
Kevin, you said something a few minutes ago that I'd love to circle back on, which was the ability to, I think one of the common questions we get at Ridge Security, especially at trade shows or different events, is, does this replace my human pen testing team? Does this replace, the need to bring in an external pen testing firm once a year? And I think the answer is always emphatically no. We are very much a complementary solution in that regard. You mentioned being able to grab credentials and then a human pen tester being able to pivot off of those credentials and do additional testing from there. Could you elaborate a little bit on how this is really a complementary solution to human pen testing?
Absolutely. For, the first aspect of that is if I have RidgeBot deployed in my environment and I run it on a continuous basis, I am going to stay well ahead of any tick box, framework, SOC 2, PCI type testing to where I have to tick the box of using that human-led pen test every year. We never suggest replacing that. What RidgeBot does is it does a lot of that heavy lifting, a lot of the setup and config of multiple open source tools to derive the same data that within, again, 2 to 5 mouse clicks in a couple of minutes that I was able to do with RidgeBot and get the results that I did. So what that does is that makes a novice team much more powerful, and it takes an expert or experienced team, and it gives them a lot of time back to focus on the magic that they do, the brain trust that they utilize, to take the RidgeBot data and then pivot it into either social engineering or, further lateral movement, further database manipulation, things to that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, really a force multiplier in that regard for pen testing teams as well.
Kevin, while we have a quick moment here, we did have a question from the audience. How does RidgeBot differ from Rapid7, or could you add a little bit more context to how we would approach that? Yeah.
So I'm very familiar with Rapid7, Tenable, and Qualys, since I've used them, in the wild, in organizations. So the difference is they each have their own risk scoring mechanism. One of them is called real risk, one of them is called total risk, and something else. That's going to give you some prioritization. But the problem with those tools is they are looking for everything. So you get all of the extra noise that goes along with it. They also do not actively exploit any of the risk in the environment, which RidgeBot does. And RidgeBot shows you that risk along with the evidence of that exploit, how we were able to do it, along with being able to download the attack logs and either pull data out and pivot in a BI tool, data lake, or spreadsheet. Gives you that much more power to look at that risk, look at the attack, exactly how RidgeBot was able to do that. And we have also satisfied multiple auditors with the reports and or log exports and attack logs out of RidgeBot.
Kevin, maybe this is a good segue to actually talk just a little bit about the use of RidgeBot in that vulnerability management team use case. I mean, I think exactly what you talked about is why we built integrations with products like Tenable, Insight VM, Qualys,
Yep.
those kinds of products, because they
Good
do
segue.
generate a tremendous amount of noise, and
Mhm.
understanding what to prioritize first, how to cut through that noise and focus on the work
Yep.
that really needs to get done is really, really critical, but hard to do.
It is hard to do because especially if you're running a rigorous program, I mean, you've got your patching team working constantly because there is no waiting for, patch Tuesday or what have you, because if it's exploitable, it needs to be patched yesterday. So with the integrations with the big three scanners, what we are going to do is connect to the cloud instance in Rapid7, Tenable, and Qualys. And what we're going to do is define a scope by either tag or site of what we want RidgeBot to validate and try to exploit. RidgeBot will then pull over the vulnerability database and the correlating asset database to those vulnerabilities. The RidgeBot will then validate those vulnerabilities and try to exploit them. If RidgeBot is successful in exploitation in Rapid7 and Tenable, we will tag those vulnerabilities with various tags denoting that those vulnerabilities are exploitable in your environment. And then RidgeBot will tag the assets in the asset database with multiple RidgeBot logos denoting that that asset in itself is exploitable. Your vulnerability and risk management teams can then prioritize based on those tags for immediate remediation to remove that risk in the environment, and then focus on whatever scoring or scoring mechanism or matrix that's used to, patch the remaining risk in the environment.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you,
if I
Kevin.
think about kind of
So,
a small to medium-sized organization with limited resources, you're getting pages and pages and pages of output from those vulnerability managers or from those vulnerability, scanning tools. Understanding what to prioritize first is really difficult. But this again, to that concept of being a force multiplier, if I can see without even disrupting my workflow in the Tenable console, that RidgeBot icon, I now know exactly what needs to go be prioritized from a remediation perspective.
And I can report on it based on those tags exactly.
Yeah.
I get an immediate prioritization list based on risk in the environment.
thanks, Kevin. We actually did have two other questions. I didn't want to derail the presentation here, but one is, can RidgeBot replace Qualys or Tenable as a vulnerability management solution? So maybe we could start with that one.
I would not, and I'll tell you why. Because like we've been saying, those tools are looking for everything. There may be something very obscure in the network that doesn't have a proof of concept that might, be something nasty that we need to remove. RidgeBot is focusing on vulnerabilities and proof of concepts that are in, NIST, DISA, CISA's lists, the KEV list, the known exploitables, things to that nature. RidgeBot's doing a much more focused exploitable risk type scan, not an overall scan. Now, if you're using one of the lesser or less powerful scanners, then I would say that RidgeBot would give those a run for their money. But I would definitely not say replace a Qualys, Tenable, or Rapid7 with Ridge for vulnerability scanning.
And then the other question, Kevin, was, can RidgeBot achieve security compliance to that effect? Essentially, if an organization is looking for external penetration testing and red teaming services, can RidgeBot replace those requirements?
I think it can enhance it if the requirement is to have a human-led pen test, then no, it doesn't replace that requirement. But I have assisted with both Brian and Dennis for our current clients trying to get through PCI, HIPAA, and SOC 2 compliance. I believe we were talking to one that was starting down ISO 27001 as well. And their auditors to date have all been very appreciative of the data that we have provided them out of RidgeBot. And it satisfied any requirements that they had across those certifications.
Should we pivot and talk a little bit about some of maybe the web application and API use cases with our last couple of minutes here?
Absolutely. Let me create a web pen test. Again, I'm going to create a new task. I'm going to select my appropriate scenario, website pen testing. Again, I need to make it a good task name. And I'm going to test Acunetics PHP website. So it's an easy target. I can let RidgeBot crawl and scrape. I can do proxy mode, which is proxying the authentication from one browser over to RidgeBot. Think CAPTCHA or multi-factor. I can still bring in a list of FQDNs, and I can limit my crawling with my target list. Again, I can run it on demand, schedule it for once, or set it up on a weekly or monthly cadence. I can slow it down if need be, and also connect to Jira On-Prem, Jira Cloud, ServiceNow, or GitLab. Email out, Slack out. In my information recon, I can let RidgeBot do a request header. I can bring in a browser certificate or token key value pair. Bear in mind that if the token or certificate expires during testing, you may need to rerun the test with a newer token. Again, alter min maxes, depth of URL. I can blacklist my logout page, my contact us page if I don't want it fuzzed. I can also limit the crawling with my whitelist. I can do recursive subdomain brute forcing to uncover any hidden attack surfaces. I can authenticate or gray box with web form autofill key value pairs of username and password and their values. In exploitation, I get my guardrails of risk control and turning off auto exploitation. And in my post exploitation for web testing or app testing, I don't have any post exploitation. So even quicker than my host pen test, I'm scanning one of my web applications. As we let that kick off and get going, I will look at my completed test. Again, red is bad, obviously. We'll go look at the topology. And I will look at this web shell. Of course. Okay, let's try this again. There we go. So it's pretty obvious that this is a website. I found my public IP, the URL, the attack surface starting, and then starting to crawl all of those URLs within that attack surface, see any issues and any exploits that RidgeBot was able to pull off on this particular target. Again, we're going to get as many vulnerabilities as RidgeBot can pull out of the vulnerability scan and then try to exploit them. Successful brute force. I can see very quickly what RidgeBot was able to do to attack this target and exploit it. Looking at the task summary, ran a little over 2,000 jobs, score of 18, attack surface of 51 with 60 vulnerabilities, and out of those 60, RidgeBot was able to exploit 9 of them. Again, full attack log from discovery to detection and validation that's downloadable. I can see my attack surface and then all of my URLs, the methods, labels, and parameters, and then my vulnerability table. I get all of my risk or my exploitable risk first, but I also get that remediation advice on anything that RidgeBot's able to find. And then the full description, again, payloads and requests and responses in that evidence file. In my risk table, multiple SQL injections, since this is a PHP website, this particular injection got 8 tables, and of those 8 tables, 1 had confidential data, again, the user table. In my weak backend password, one of my developers left a test account on this particular URL. So now I can have my human pen tester take this and see if they can get further, get deeper into the environment, or pivot in a different way. So RidgeBot's done all of that heavy lifting, that initial work for the human-led pen tester to then take that data and do other things. Again, reporting wise, for my web pen testing, I get a couple of other options. Again, I've got standard, custom, and raw data, but I get a couple of OWASP top 10 reports, and then my Plex track extract. On my top 10, I'll create that, generate it. While that's being generated, I have one that's pulled up already. Again, I'll make it bigger. Task name, date, and timestamp. My disclaimer. Then the start of my executive summary. I can see that I did do a top 10 compliance, full vulnerabilities and exploits, and then where my risk, including vulnerabilities, lies across the OWASP top 10 in this particular web application or pen test. Exploits by risk, risk summary. Again, if you're doing an executive summary, it would end here. Asset and fingerprinting details, and then directly into the exploitable risk with vectors, scoring, description, solution, and references. And then the kill chain analysis of how RidgeBot was able to exploit this. Again, we will not show the passwords on the reporting. We do that in the tool. And then onto the SQL injection with all of the information needed to remediate that along with the attack vectors. Again, we get all the way down to informational if that's what you want to see in the reporting as far as remediation and mitigation advice. And then we map the attack surface of the web application across the top 10 and show you where your risk lies across that attack surface with the OWASP top 10. And looking at time, I will kick off an API test, and then we'll look at that real quick, Brian, and then we can re-engage. How's that sound?
Yeah, sounds great, Kevin.
Again, I'm going to create a new task. I'm going to look at my APIs, give it a good name. So I have a couple of different options for my APIs. If I've got a RESTful API, I can import my Swagger file. If I've got GraphQL, I can go grab my SDL file to pull my endpoints in and test them that way. I've got a REST API, so I'm going to go grab my Swagger file. Come on. There we go. RidgeBot is going to validate that my Swagger file is good and in working order and can be pen tested. It's going to automatically pull my API endpoints in and also load any user parameters that I may need to interact with. And I am going to add an admin user to test different levels of my API authentication for weaknesses. And I'm going to put in 2 standard users with different levels of credentials. And then user 2. So I'm going to run it now. I'm going to leave it normal speed, not going to connect to anything. I don't need any browser because I've provided credentials in my quick configuration screen. Don't need to alter anything here. And in my exploitation, I'll leave everything alone. So I've got my Swagger file. RidgeBot has validated it. I've put in user parameters to test my API at different authentication levels, and I'm going to run it. So in the time frame that we've been talking, I've kicked off 3 different pen tests for 3 different parts of an environment. Granted, this is a demo environment, but it's just as easy to do this in a production environment if you've got the data that you need to test. With my API testing, I get the same look and feel on the reporting. I can do custom raw data. I get the top 10 and that Plex track extract. That's hard to say, Plex track extract. I'll generate that. Again, that shows up in my reports column. One feature I didn't show you, you can encrypt these reports. I highly suggest that you do that due to the sensitive nature of the data. And here is my API pen testing report. After going through multiple pen test and audit reports, I can say that the familiarity across the reporting is nice because a lot of times just due to the type of testing you're doing, you get different types of reporting. We described the API penetration testing methodology, and then into our executive summary, we can see that this is a top 10 report, all of my vulnerabilities, my exploits, my adherence to the OWASP top 10 and where my risk lies across those silos, my exploits by type, and then risk, summary, asset details and fingerprints, and then into my exploitable risk. We've got broken access, broken object level authorization, so a BOLO attack, full attack vectors, again, references, and then here's my evidence with my attack request and response and what my legitimate request and response should be. Then the kill chain analysis of how RidgeBot was able to exploit this. And then on to my next broken object level authorization issue with evidence. Then kill chain analysis. And then on to a broken object property level authorization or a BOPLA attack. And then the evidence and kill chain analysis of how RidgeBot was able to exploit that. And as with the other types of testing scenarios and reporting, again, full remediation advice down through informational if you want to see it. And then in my attack surface across my API, I get that top 10 comparison and where my issues lie and across what API endpoints the risk is in. So very quickly, I can get to the bottom of where the risk is in my environment, whether it's network or host, web or web application, or API. I can then also look at security controls after I've pen tested and reduced that risk and augment or tweak or add to my security controls covering endpoint, Active Directory, and data loss prevention.
Thanks for driving today, Kevin. Really appreciate
Sure.
the walkthrough of the platform. I think the API pen testing for me has always been interesting to see just how many of them are out in the world, and the data that's inadvertently leaking out a lot of those really is sort of the wild west of cybersecurity, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen it in proof of concepts and at our clients of, hidden paths not being included in the Swagger file, leaking username and credential in plain text. I mean, we've seen it. I'm glad I didn't have to deal with APIs as a practitioner because it would have cost me more sleep than I had already lost based on everything else going on in the world with being in cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to thank everybody for joining our presentation today. We will continue this webinar series going forward with new features, new functionality, new releases of the RidgeBot platform in the not too distant future. Dennis, before we adjourn, are there any last questions or comments coming through the chat?
Not that I have seen, Brian, but now is the chance for anyone who has any remaining questions while we have 10 minutes left here.
The one thing I'll say while we're waiting to see if there are any last minute questions, if you'd like to see a demonstration of the RidgeBot platform, please visit us, ridgesecurity.ai. There's a button to request a demo. We'd be happy to schedule a personalized demonstration for you wherever you're located in the world, get you connected with our appropriate sales teams. Would love to show you what the solution can do for you if that's of interest or if we piqued your interest over the course of this presentation. All right. Well, I think with that, we'll go ahead and end today's session. Thanks so much for joining. Please look forward to future installments of the series. We'll make announcements via LinkedIn and all of our other marketing channels for our next installment coming up in August. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.